Okay, tonight I want to introduce a subject which is it's complicated. There are certain subtleties that are involved in it. I'm working on something on this subject, so this is a kind of summary of some of the material. Individual providence. Particular, some people seem to think that providence, individual divine supervision and interaction in life is limited to certain great people, great tzaddikim, perhaps applies to the Jewish people as a whole. But other than that, there's a system of nature, and nature operates on its own. Yes, on occasion, God intervenes to cause things to happen that need to happen, but the rest of the time, He allows the world to run in a blind, unsupervised, that's crucial, unsupervised fashion, and therefore what happens to me on a day-by-day basis may have no particular special spiritual meaning or spiritual relevance, as opposed to great people for whom that's not true. Now, in studying this topic, there's a fundamental distinction between two different concepts. I heard this concept in the name of Yaakov Weinberg of Bnei Yisrael in Baltimore, and it's based on two passages in the Ramban, Nachmanides, both in his commentary on the Chumash. I want to read them to you and translate them for you, so you can see that at the outset they appear to be contradictory, and then I hope to show you why they in fact are not contradictory. So, in the book of Genesis, God tells Abraham about God's plans to destroy the city of Sodom. As a prelude, God says, as if to say, shall I or shall I not? Revealed to Abraham what I'm going to do. And the resolution, of course, is that he will. And one of the reasons because ki yadativ. Now, you could translate that, for I know him. Yada means to know. But it means other things as well. And this is what the Ramban says. What is correct in my eyes, she yediya bo mamish, it refers to yediya with respect to Abraham, actually, truly, literally. Now, but what does that mean? Yirmos, it hints. Ki yediyas Hashem, God's yediyah, shehi hashgachaso ba'olam hashafel, that is God's supervision in the lower world. When it's called yediyah in Hebrew, says the Ramban, it means God's supervision, hashgacha. He lishmor haklalim. Number one, that supervision and provision for the lower world is to preserve general categories of things. V'gam b'nei adam munachim bo lemikrim. But people, individual people, are situated in this general providence for chance. For chance. Not any supervision or purpose or function or meaning or value. No, for chance. Ad bo eis b'kudasam. Until the time comes when something has to be done to them or for them, yes, then maybe, perhaps, then they will be singled out by providence, but otherwise, they are situated in God's providence in a situation of chance. Aber b'chasidov, with respect to God's pious ones, Yosum elav libo ladas oso befrat. God sets his heart to know him individually, which is not true for the vast majority of people, just for his pious ones. Liyosh miroso dovka bo tomid, that God's care and preserving protection is attached to him continuously. Lo tipared ha'yediyah v'haschir mimenu klal. God's yediyah, for the sake of the pious one, will not be separated from him at all. Like the verse says, Ketam lo yigara mitzadik enov, God's eyes will not be missing from the righteous person. Ubal mizeh psukim Rabbi, many verses describe this idea. Kidiksiv, hine ein Hashem edireyav. God's eye is present for those who have awe of him and fear of him, and many others. So here is an expression of the attitude that I mentioned at the beginning, that God's providence, his connection to the person, is reserved for a tiny, tiny minority of the select few who are great, righteous, and pious people. Everybody else is, in general, abandoned to chance, although for many people, perhaps all people at one point or another, there may come a time where they need some individual attention, but the rest of the time, there's no individual, no connection, no individual attention, you're just abandoned. That's what he says in Genesis. Now, in a famous passage at the end of Parshas Bo, in the book of Exodus, the Ramban speaks as follows. He's speaking about the great miracles of the Exodus, and he makes the following famous remark. Umin anisim hagdolim hamafursamim adam modeh benisim hanistarim. From the great public miracles, a person admits, asserts, agrees to the existence of hidden miracles. Hidden miracles. Not the crossing of the sea, not the revelation of the Torah at Sinai, not the plagues in Egypt. No, hidden miracles. Shem Yesod HaTorah Kula, that they are the foundation of the whole Torah. She'ein lo adam chelik b'Torahs Moshe Rabbeinu ad shena'amin b'chol dvareinu u'mikrenu shekulam nisim ein behem teva u'minhago shel olam. I'm going to translate this word for word. A person has no share in Moses' Torah unless we believe that in all of our affairs and in our, the word here is the same word mikra, which I translated as chance in the first passage. Our so-called chance events, a person must believe that all of them are miracles. There isn't in them the nature of the world and the way of the world. They're all miracles. Whether it's the community or the individual. And therefore, if a person does mitzvos, then his reward will cause him success. And if he violates the mitzvos, then his punishment will cut him off. Hakol b'gzeres elyon. Everything through a divine decree, a decree coming from God. Now, it's really quite hard to make consistent sense out of those two passages. Indeed, the word mikra is used in both of them. And in the first passage, he says, the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of time, are abandoned to mikra. And in the second passage, he says, anybody who believes in mikra has no share in Moses' Torah. All of what we think of as mikra is really miracles. Direct miracles with the decree of the divine. So there's a problem here. The same author, the same work, both in his commentary on the Torah, both written at the end of his life. So Yaakov Weinberg explained as follows. The concept of hashgacha, divine providence, divine supervision, divine management of the world, divine not only and control of the world, breaks into two dimensions. There are two dimensions of providence. And sometimes a passage will speak of one, and some will speak of the other one. And even if it's the same vocabulary, you have to understand that the vocabulary is double. Doesn't mean the same thing in both cases. One is a concept of divine control and causation. control and causation. God is making things happen. And you could ask, how far does that go? Direct, divine control and causation of making things happen. Here, you might wonder whether God didn't just create nature and let it run, and then it's happening, going by itself, until he intervenes from time to time. That's a matter of control and causation. That's one. The other concept of providence is the purpose for which the control and causation is exercised. And in particular, in this passage of the Ramban, it's preservation. Preservation is one thing. That's when the control and the causation is for the sake of preserving. Not always is the control and causation for the sake of preserving. Sometimes it's destructive. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by divine causation and control. And you could ask, how often does God's, or to what identity and entities, to what, in what circumstances, under what conditions does God's causation and control serve the purpose of preserving? And if you say in only 1% of the cases, that would mean that in 99% of the cases, God's causation and control doesn't preserve. It does something else, other things. But that wouldn't call into question the extent of his control and causation, because that's a different subject. One is built on the other, but they're different subjects. Now, if you go back and think of the two passages, it's almost word for word. Because in the first passage, he's talking only about preservation. He says so explicitly. He says God's shmirah, his preserving, his protecting, attaches itself to his pious ones and not to everybody else. He says God's providence applies to the general categories, because there is an idea that general categories don't go out of existence, and also to the great tzaddikim, the great pious ones. And everybody else is placed within that concept of providence for chance, meaning it isn't preservation for them. It's not always preservation for them. It could be preservation, it could be destruction, it could be not acting so as to preserve or destroy, but have other factors taken into consideration. That's where he says there is mikra, there is chance. Chance means not preservation and protection. And in the second passage, he says, but if you're talking about control, if you're talking about control and causation, that blankets everything. And therefore, everything that happens, behold, varenu mikrenu, all of our affairs and all of the things which we think of as just neutral events that take place, all of them are nisim, are miracles. They all come because of a divine decree. All of them, every last one of them. Nothing in it is teva, which is nature, or minhago shel olam, the way of the world. There is no way of the world. It's all miracles. So, if you distinguish between the two concepts, then you have a way of reconciling the two passages. And that means that whenever you're talking about providence, you have to decide what you mean. Or when you're looking at a text, to decide what the text means. And be sure you know which concept is in play. Otherwise, you can end up with terrible confusion. Now, what I want to show you is that the idea of the Ramban, that everything that happens to us has this miraculous nature, is not something that the Ramban said because he's a Kabbalist, and maybe a philosopher would disagree. That's this conceit that you have in a lot of the academic studies, which has no foundation whatsoever. First, I want to show you that there are many sources that are neutral, that are ubiquitous in the tradition, which no one can deny, no one can differ with, and they indicate causation and control in all aspects of everyone's life. And even Maimonides, who is supposed to be the representative of philosophy, the representative of nature, so on and so on, says things which make such an idea very, very hard to accept. So I'm trying to argue for the ubiquitous nature of God's control. And what I really want to say is that it's inappropriate to say that it's a disagreement. If there is a disagreement, it's a very subtle one. It's not that one holds that God abandoned the earth and it runs on automatic pilot, and the other says that God is involved in every moment. I think that's a mistake. So let's start the review of, and this is a selection of the sources, but I think it introduces you at least to some of the background of the subject. Let's start with punishment for transgressions. One of the most serious pair is called Kores and Misa B'dei Shamayim. Kores means being cut off, and Misa B'dei Shamayim means death at the hands of heaven, which sometimes means shortening one's life in this world. Or where, for example, someone who offers his children to Molech, which was an idolatrous practice in ancient times, God says the following words: I have set my attention on that person to punish him. He did this, I'm setting my attention on him to punish him. Now let me ask you, is this a force of nature, blind nature? Surely not. But this guy isn't one of the pious. He's not one of the righteous. He's not one of the special ones. But he seems to be getting very particular individual divine attention, doesn't he? So that at least for him, their actions are going to be dealt with by divine punishment individually. Now, the Rambam himself writes in the 8th chapter of the Shemona Prakim and also in the Mishnah Torah that punishment, divine punishment, can occur in 3 different ways. It can be in this world, holy, or in the next world, holy, or in both worlds. And he says, only Hashem knows how each transgression should be punished. So imagine a person doing a crime. And imagine divine providence regarding such a person. Well, if it's a certain type of crime, he's going to be punished in this world in various ways, and only in this world. If it's another type of crime, he's going to be punished only in the next world. This world he can sail through, but only in the next world. And in some places, he's going to be punished in both worlds. Doesn't that mean when the person performs the crime, there's an analysis going on? There's an evaluation, a classification going on? Reuven did that. Well, what kind of that is it? Which category does it fall into? And let's see, if it's in this worldly category, then I'm going to plan certain things to happen to him in this world in order to compensate for this particular transgression. Does that sound like because he's not one of the pious ones, he's abandoned the blind nature? He's certainly not one of the pious ones. In the first passage of the Ramban, he said, only the pious ones get providence. Only the pious. No one else. Everyone else is put into providence for mikrim, for chance, for happenstance, for accidental events. Doesn't sound like it. So something's wrong here. Yeah.
Some decisions have a negative impact on your life, so therefore, let's say taking a sin will cause a negative impact, and also for the life now, and the effect on the next world. So the sin itself causes an issue in your soul, so therefore you're going to suffer the punishment just as a consequence of the sin itself, not because of any divine providence deciding that this is going to cause a punishment.
I'm lost. The alternative to divine providence is Teva, which is nature, or the way of the world. Right?
Is it not running through Teva, that when you do that Avera, you damage your soul, so therefore you're going to suffer in the next world? That's a causation from the Avera itself that causes your soul to be damaged.
You cause your soul to be damaged, but why then should you choke on your glass of water? Punishment in this world means something happens to him that hurts him in this world. He falls down a flight of stairs. Maybe you damage your soul, but why should you fall down a flight of stairs? He said you're going to fall down a flight of stairs because you did the transgression. Had you not done the transgression, you wouldn't have fallen down a flight of stairs. That's punishment in this world. Now, the Rambam the philosopher, says in the guide, part 3, chapter 17, the following astonishing statement. Every pleasure that a person enjoys, no matter how small, is a reward for a mitzvah that he's done. And every pain that a person experiences, no matter how small, is a punishment for a crime that he's committed. Every pleasure and every pain. I just ask you, by pain he means you got a thorn stuck in your finger and you pulled it out. Ask yourself, how often in a single day do you have pleasures and pains? Lots, hey? Lots. Every last one of them is linked to your moral and spiritual performance. Is that abandonment to blind nature? Mechanical nature? I don't see how you could imagine such a thing. This is hundreds of times a day. This is not an automatic system with no divine management involved. Yeah.
And it's all in the same life, right? It's not like from years today pain from previous life, right? No?
The Ramban never affirms the idea of previous lives. He doesn't. He never uses it. Never mentions it. Certainly can't associate it with his philosophy. Did you want to ask a question?
What about forbidden pleasures?
What about
What
about forbidden pleasures? Oh, it's an interesting question. Off the top of my head, I might change my mind later, but off the top of my head, I would say the fact that it's a pleasure must be a reward for a previous, that he experiences the pleasure. Otherwise, he wouldn't experience the pleasure at all. He's going after that cheeseburger. He lost his taste and smell from COVID. Doggone! He eats it, but doesn't enjoy it because God took away his ability to sense it. That could happen also. Of course, if it's forbidden, he'll be punished for that also, and he'll suffer a pain for it later. But there doesn't have to be any incompatibility there. But certainly, this is not abandonment to blind forces of nature. Then there are certain sources in the tradition which are uncontroversial, accepted by everyone, which indicate the same idea. One is this. When a person does a mitzvah, he receives a certain amount of divine protection and salvation. It's a Gemara in Sota, 21a. That means the divine providence responds to his individual action of performing the mitzvah with a special measure of divine care. Every mitzvah earns you a certain amount of divine protection that you wouldn't otherwise have. There's nothing in the nature of the world that because you put on tefillin, you shouldn't catch a cold today. But that could be the outcome because you get some kind of protection that you didn't have before. Take how many mitzvahs do you do in a day? You do lots of mitzvahs in a day. Every mitzvah you do gets a divine response. Does that sound like you're abandoned to the blind forces of nature? Secondly, when the person is in the process of preparing to do a mitzvah, he's trying to go. He's going to do the mitzvah, get the means of the mitzvah. He's protected against certain types of dangers. For example, he's on the way to the Beis Medrash to study. Gemara says he gets protection against certain kinds of dangers because he's going to do a mitzvah, he's not going to do something else. So again, that's not something that blind natural forces would explain. It's in Psachim 8a. There's a verse that prescribes taking tithes from agricultural produce. When you have agricultural produce, you're supposed to take off certain parts and give 10% to the Levi and 1% roughly to a Kohen, and then another 2% to a Kohen. When the verse prescribes doing that, it doubles the verb aser ta'aser, which is just two ways of saying take a tenth. And the Talmud comments, separate the tithes in order to become rich. Aser kadesh tis asher. Take off a tenth so that you should become rich. Playing with the word ayin sin resh, making it into ayin shin resh. That's what the Gemara says. And the Gemara asks, you're telling me to take it off in order to become rich. Is it permissible to test God? And the Gemara says, yes, in this it's permissible to test God. Go right ahead, test him. You'll see it works. That's not blind nature. Absolutely not. You took off your tithes, God will repay you. Here's another example. Now, then we can stop and discuss these things if you like. The Talmud restates stories of two people who were in mortal danger and saved miraculously. One case is where a person, it's a very interesting story, Shmuel, the great sage, Amora, had a friend who was a non-Jewish sorcerer named Ablat. They were sitting together, and a group of Jewish workers were on their way out to the swamp to cut reeds. And Ablat pointed to one of them and said, he's not coming back. He's going to die out there. And Shmuel said, no, he won't. So they go out, and they all come back, including that one who's supposed to die. And Shmuel calls him over and says, open up your sack and let me see what you cut. So he opens it up, empties it out, and in the sack of the cut reeds, there's a poisonous snake which his side had chopped in half. So Shmuel said to him, did anything unusual happen today in your workforce? He said, well, I'm in charge. What happens is everybody brings food, and it's put into a central store, and then it's divided up among all the workers. And I was in charge. One guy didn't bring any food. That would mean that he wouldn't get any. So I pretended to put in for him. When it came his turn, I managed to arrange it so it appeared that he was putting in. And then when I gave it out, he was able to take food. So Shmuel said, Tzedakah tatzil mimovis. Charity saves from death. Meaning, Ablat, when he said, you're going to die out there, wasn't hallucinating. He wasn't entirely off track. There was a poisonous snake waiting for you. It was waiting for you. Whatever the powers are that run the world, they definitely had you in mind that you should die. Ah, but you did an act of charity. If you do an act of charity, you can trump those forces. Your act of charity trumps those forces. Same thing's true. Rabbi Kiva's daughter was getting married, and she was preparing, and a poor person appeared at the household asking for charity. Everybody else was busy, and she gave some charity. Later, she changed her headdress, and her headdress was held on by a long, sharp pin. So she took it off, and she stuck it in the wall. I guess it was a wooden wall to hold it up, and then went about her business. And when she came back, she saw that when she stuck the pin in the wall, it severed a poisonous snake that was there. So she says this to her father. You know, I was in mortal danger. He said, did you do anything special? And she says, I gave money to that poor person today. And he said, Tzedakah tatzil mimovis. Now these two cases are cases where the natural forces, whatever they are, had death in store for them. But they did a mitzvah. They did a mitzvah. That trumps the natural forces. These were not great tzaddikim. Neither of these people is held up as a great pious person, 1% of the most devoted to God. They did an action of charity. An action of charity has an effect on changing the outcome and trumps nature. These are not people who have been abandoned to blind, accidental natural forces. Certainly not. Question? Yeah.
So, if you, let's say, go into the base madrasa, or if you're going to do a mitzvah and something bad happens, would we assume that even if you were doing something else, as in going somewhere else, that something bad would also happen?
It's an interesting question. You've asked it, I think, in a clever way, because not all connections like that are going to work. But here you're saying if there was a presence of protection, and even so it happened. Let me explain the sophistication in his question. He understands already that when I say that this is the rule, rules have exceptions. Rules are not absolute rules. So this much would happen unless there's some other feature in play that's more important than this, and then they could trump it. But he's using the argument backwards. This protection in this case wasn't trumped. This protection actually, I'm sorry.
Was trumped.
Yeah, it was trumped. So the protection was trumped, that surely if you didn't have the protection, that the damage would have taken place. But I don't think that's right, because once you change one feature, that can have all sorts of consequences. And it could be that it'll be worse example for somebody else, could drive you to despair, or there are maybe other features which trump even that. So to make a positive statement, just as you yourself took into account when you asked your question, that a rule can have exceptions. So to say that there's a rule, you're asking me for a rule that it would have happened for sure, that also could have exceptions. I'm not going to commit to any rule being absolute.
What would be an example of other factors that you mentioned?
Well, one, for example, is the impression that it would make on other people. Right? Or if it costs you, then you wouldn't be able to treat your children in the same way. Or, I mean, it's endless. Or your own resolve, to people who pray for something, who think that if I pray and I don't get what I ask for, then God's not listening. So that person will come to the conclusion that God's not listening, and then it could be a disaster. So there are too many factors to give a general rule to. But you could speak of it as a tendency, as let's say a norm, unless overridden by other things. I would credit your logic that way. If even with this special protection you got hurt, so then normally the conclusion would be that without this special protection you certainly would have gotten hurt, unless something else might stand in the way. But the logic is good logic, yeah.
Can we still test about the taking the mice nowadays?
The people, I think I made this mistake also. My son pointed this out to me because it's in the Shari Tshuva. This is speaking specifically about agricultural tithes from produce in the land of Israel going to a Levi or a Kohen or etc. Not talking about all charity, not talking about all good deeds. It's talking specifically about that. So it's probably hard for you to test it. Yeah.
Rabbi, so my question is about whether those rules stand in the test of reality. So within the second example of someone going to make a mitzvah, I think it's kind of like hard evidence to collect. But with the first example of each thing that we do either got reward or punishment for. The obvious example is like babies. That if babies are suffering, so what have they done? That they got punished with pain and so forth.
They're not punished. They can't be punished. They can't be punished. Punishment means response to a crime, right? They're not committing any crimes. They suffer, not being punished.
Yeah, so they suffer. Okay,
so obviously, if you're talking about reward and punishment for actions for which you're responsible, you're only talking about adults.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's just a category mistake to ask that question. Yeah.
Can we also say that there's certain sufferings that exist for people who could be responsible for things, certain sufferings that exist that have nothing to do with reward and punishment?
So it's very interesting. The Ramban, Nachmanides, says that. He says that the kinds of pains, and he's speaking about pains in terms of suffering, but the same would go for pleasures. The kinds of pains that we regard as normal in life, normal in everyday life, we wouldn't notice it if it happened to us or happened to other people, they don't have to have any explanation. He does say that. But I'm quoting Maimonides now, the philosopher, the one who's supposed to believe in blind nature, the one who's supposed to believe in less personal providence. He's the one who says every pain and every pleasure without any exception whatsoever. Right? So that makes a very striking statement. Yeah.
I also wanted to ask, in regards to certain pleasures or certain suffering caused by another person, in that instance, they're freely acting. So why would we assume?
If I get a chance to get to it, I have that on these notes. I have that on these notes. Okay. Now, what about prayer? Everybody believes that one should pray. The fundamental essence of prayer is petition, asking God to give you things. Not only is there the fixed prayer, which we have a responsibility to recite word for word, but we are encouraged to put into the prayer our own individual needs. Now, the assumption behind prayer is that my praying could change the outcome. Listen carefully. Could change the outcome. Not will change the outcome, but could change the outcome. If I were convinced that my prayer could not possibly have any effect on the outcome, then I wouldn't pray. Indeed, there is such a position that everything is decided on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and all of what's happening in the following year is already settled on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And the Gemara asks, according to that position, why do we pray? Because if it's really fixed on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, then your prayer can't change anything. And if you can't change anything, you're not going to pray. So one answer is we pray according to a different opinion, Rav Yossi's opinion, who says it isn't fixed that way in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Others say that although what will happen in general terms, but the way it will happen isn't fixed, and that you could change. For example, let's take rainfall. Will the rainfall be plentiful or scarce this year? Okay, that could be fixed, let's say, on Rosh Hashanah. This particular area of the world is going to have plentiful rainfall. But will it all fall in the space of 10 days in the middle of the winter and the rest of the year be absolute drought? That could happen. That would be a disaster. Or if it's distributed in an appropriate way, it'll be very fruitful. So, although the absolute amount of rainfall can be fixed, the way in which it falls is not fixed. Bottom line, the tradition is telling us that prayer is only for something where the prayer could change it. Well, if prayer changes it, then you're not abandoned to the natural forces, blind forces of nature, because prayer is not going to affect the outcome of any of these things on the basis of the blind forces of nature. No, it means the prayers are being heard. They may not always work, but they always could work. They're not ruled out. If they were ruled out, then we wouldn't pray. So, I think that this indicates we're certainly not abandoned. Now, I want to broaden this idea in a certain way. Up till now, I've made it sound like providence expresses itself in making things happen. Punishment or reward or protection, making things happen. I want to broaden the concept, this now is my idea, that it should include more. It's not just God making something happen, not just what, for example, the Ramban calls hidden miracles. I want providence to extend, even if you didn't go with the Ramban, that everything that happens is hidden miracles. I'm going to give you an example. Let's imagine you're a parent and you have a 6-year-old child and you're at the playground. Now, here's what you do. This is your way of dealing with your child. You sit on a bench and you watch him. And he goes and does what he wants. And as long as what he's doing is safe, you let him do whatever he wants. The minute he tries to do something that's unsafe, you get up from the bench, you run over to him, and you catch him and stop him. Would you say that your supervision of the child is operating only when you get up off the bench and save him? Is that when you're supervising him? And the rest of the time when you're sitting on the bench, you're not supervising him because you're not acting on him, you're not causing something to happen to him? Is that what you would say? I doubt it. I think you would say you're supervising him the whole time. It's just that, given what you want for him, most of the time, you don't have to act on him for the results to be the results you want. Even if I don't act on him, he's getting the experience and learning the coordination that I want him to get and want him to learn. So the question now is this: when we talk about divine providence, are we concerned with divine miracles, miraculous causation? Is that what we're concerned about? Or is what we're concerned about supervision? Seems to me, whether you put causation in or not is not relevant. I don't care whether God is making the swing and making the water fall. What I want to know is, if I got wet, that's because God wanted me to get wet. He thought it was right for me under these conditions to get wet. And if I was protected, it's because God wanted me to be protected. The protection came from the umbrella that I carried from the house, so what? God saw what I was doing and decided, yeah, this is what he needs. This is what's good for him. So I don't think we have to go as far as the Ramban. The Ramban is Kodesh Kadoshim. He says you have it in spades. You have miraculous divine control operating all the time. But you don't need to go there. If you believed in nature, and maybe you thought it was a difference of opinion between Maimonides and Nachmanides. Maybe you think you have other sources that believe in nature. I don't think they're right. But even if you did, what I want to point out is that the nature of connection to God and the nature of God's supervision, his caring that things happen to me individually, micro-management in the way in which God has chosen for me, that's certainly correct. Whether it's direct divine causation or not direct divine causation, I don't think that's a relevant point. Now, there's another thing that the Rambam says, which people cite in this connection, which I think, again, is misunderstood. In the commentary on the Mishnah says that 10 things were created in the last hours of the sixth day of creation, the very last hours. And they are items which play a role in great miraculous events later on in history, like the crossing of the sea or the speaking donkey that spoke to Bilam. These things were created in the last hours of creation, on the 6 days. After that, nothing new was created. Well, I've heard people say what the Rambam is telling us is that everything is nature. Everything is nature. Even these seemingly miraculous ones aren't really miraculous because they're built in from the very beginning. When they occur thousands of years later, they occur because they were built in at the beginning. For these people, the idea of miracle is something which God makes happen at the moment. What makes it miraculous is that God's finger is stirring the soup now. And according to Maimonides, that's not so. Now, Maimonides goes even further, and this is what motivates them. Maimonides says it's not just the 10 in the Mishnah. The 10 are just examples. Everything's like that. Everything's like that. All the other miracles, these were just examples. And all the things that happened later, which we see as miracles, they were all pre-programmed into the state of the world, which creation process stopped at the end of the sixth day. Now, this is a double mistake. First of all, Maimonides defines nature. I think that he agrees with Aristotle. Listen carefully, he didn't take it from Aristotle. Maimonides took nothing from Aristotle. He read it in Aristotle and he decided to accept it because he thought it was true. And when he read things in Aristotle that he thought were false, he said they're false. The definition of nature is that which happens always or almost always. You put a raw egg into boiling water at sea level, fresh water, not salt water, and 5 minutes later it's going to come out hard. That's nature. You throw a ball randomly in a room that's 50 feet by 50 feet, which has a circular bucket on the floor, which has a diameter of 1 foot, and you close your eyes and throw it randomly, it's not going to fall in the bucket. Maybe once in 500 times it'd fall in the bucket, but the rest of the time it's not going to fall in the bucket. That would be nature. That doesn't fall in the bucket. Something that never happens, like the splitting of the sea, is not nature. No matter when it's programmed, no matter when it's caused, no matter when it's built in, it's not nature because it's not always or almost always. The fact that it was programmed in the 6 days of creation doesn't mean that it's natural. The things that were programmed in the 6 days of creation, some of them are natural and some of them are not natural, by the definition of what nature is. So to think that he's subtly against miracles, really not Aristotelian, he really wasn't from, and all the rest of the kind of stuff you hear in academia, you certainly can't bring a riot from that. But it's more than that. It's more than that. Let's take the splitting of the sea. That happened at a specific time and place. Why? Why did it happen at a specific time and place? Because God foresaw that at that time and place, the sea needs to split to save the Jewish people. Which means that when he programmed it during the 6 days of creation, he took into account the later events so as to program something in at that time which will appear and be useful at the time when it's needed. Now imagine you're standing there at the sea. Egyptians are bearing down on you, and there are mountains to this side, mountains on that side, and the sea behind you, and the Egyptian army coming down at you, and Moses says, don't worry. And then people say, Moses, don't worry. Come on, I'm from Brooklyn. This is terrible. We're going to die. Right? Moses says, don't worry. Okay, so now the sea splits, and we walk across, and we're saved, and it closes on the Egyptians, and we say, thank you, God, for your great miracle. And somebody says, sorry, back to philosophy 1. God programmed that 1,500 years ago. He programmed it 1,500 years ago. So I shouldn't say thank you? I shouldn't say thank you? Why not? Because right now God's on vacation, you know? He's playing pinochle someplace. Yeah, but 1,500 years ago, he foresaw that I'm going to be here and I'm going to need it. So, taking me into account, he built it in so that when it was necessary, it would save me. Why shouldn't I say thank you? The fact that it happened 1,500 years ago doesn't deprive it of its status of being providence, individual providence for the person in his specific circumstances. Now, I'm going to make a little jump here. I've had resistance from certain people, but I can't hear the logic of the resistance. If Maimonides has in the list of the ones that are stated explicitly, ones which involve divine foreknowledge, they were planned ahead for those individual circumstances, shall I say, oh, God sometimes uses his foreknowledge and sometimes not. Sometimes he sort of doesn't look it up in his encyclopedia of future events, and so forth and so on. I think that's absurd. It means that programming things in the 6 days of creation takes into account the later events and the later consequences that they will have. So even if you thought that what's called nature is programmed in this way, so then indeed it's going to play out in terms of the normal repetitive categories of nature, but God foresaw how that nature would interact with individual people and chose it to interact in ways that he wanted for them. So at every point in time, a person could say, this is what God wanted for me because of where I am in the individual circumstances of my life. These, I think, this is Maimonides talking now, the one who's supposed to believe in nature. So I think that the idea of specific providence, individual providence, in terms of control and causation and management is inescapable. What's reserved for tzaddikim is only preservation and protection. And in between, you have other purposes for which God can exercise the control. Reward and punishment is something we've mentioned a number of times. There's one thing that Maimonides says in the commentary in the Mishnah, his introduction of the commentary in the Mishnah. He says, it's a larger context, but this is the point that he makes. It can happen that God will cause a certain person to become wealthy. A person whom, in normal circumstances, you would think, in terms of reward and punishment, doesn't deserve it. And it's not happenstance, because this guy, with all his wealth, builds a palace in the forest with a big wall around it and all the trappings of a palace. Years later, a tzaddik, great pious person, is traveling through the forest, and he's tired, and he's hot, and he sees this wall in the forest. And by golly, the slant of the sun causes the wall to cast a shadow. He goes over, he sits down in the shadow, and he relaxes, and he cools off, and he recovers his strength, and then he travels on. That's why the guy became rich. He became rich so as to be able to benefit the tzaddik who's going to come through years later. Now, that's God using his foreknowledge, no question about it. But think what it means. It means that the guy who became rich, who didn't deserve the riches, was experiencing direct individual divine providence. It wasn't his friend that became rich. He became rich. He became rich so as to benefit the tzaddik. So certainly, divine providence, individual divine providence, is not limited to great people who deserve great connections, so forth and so on. Here, a person can be used as a means to benefiting somebody else. I think these sources. There are more. I'm writing a book on the subject, but this should give you a feeling that to deny the idea of individual providence would be a very, very radical step. You'd have to deny all these sources and more that I have collected. So I think you should feel confidence in understanding that your life is not random and it's not abandoned. Also, the way the verse describes the attitude of heretics, God has abandoned the earth. This is one of the claims that the prophets identify as a claim of a heretic, someone who's denying the truth of the world the way the Torah sees it. Okay? Okay.